You're listening to a Reliance podcast, conversations and insights about our efforts to end sexual violence in one generation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is an exciting day. I saw many of your faces in the swamp for the press conference earlier, and so I think it's very fitting that you join us here to talk and listen to the folks who work on the front lines at our rape crisis centers across the country, working on violence against women and ending sexual violence. We are grateful to have you attend the briefing of the work of rape crisis centers, community leaders addressing and ending sexual violence, sponsored by Reliance and the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. Reliance is a national partnership dedicated to ending sexual violence in one generation. Through the collaborative effort, the reach and influence of our partners, Reliance advances prevention initiatives across all industries by awarding grants, advancing research, and influencing policy and helping leaders establish safe environments and strong communities. Our name, Reliance, represents bringing together the many strengths and resources of the three founding agencies. The National Prevention Efforts Reliance relies on growing our expertise, credibility to advance prevention innovation, and a rallying cry for additional partners and allies to join us in our work. Our tagline, Ending Sexual Violence in One Generation, was chosen to represent our urgency, the boldness and determination of our organizations and the programs who join us across the country in really speaking out that it is time for us to end sexual violence. And we have the ability to do it when we work together. Reliance was founded in 2015 through a multi-million-dollar seed investment by the National Football League, who we're happy to have join us here this afternoon. The NFL's initial funding, along with the inclusion of a wide variety of community-based partners, has empowered Reliance to boldly fight and advocate for a world free from sexual harassment, misconduct, and abuse once and for all. Reliance combined is building upon over 70 years of collective experience and resources from the top three organizations. We are fortunate to have the Cal CASA join us today through Prevent Connect. As indicated by their name, they're located in California, and they are the leading national online resource center to advance the prevention of sexual violence and support development, implementation, and evaluation of innovative prevention practices. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center is the national resource center providing information and tools to prevent and respond to sexual violence, translating research and trends into best practices, and promoting social change in communities. Lastly, the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. We are the leading voice that represents the 1,500 rape crisis centers across the country here in D.C., influencing policy. It is one of our key strategies for ending sexual violence is promoting strong policy. We are currently working on legislation, and we're excited to say H.R. 1585 will be on the floor. And as I mentioned earlier, there have been press conferences, and hopefully there'll be a vote tomorrow morning. So please, if you have not reached out to your legislators, for those of you who are listening and those of you who are in the room, please do so. It is going to take all of us to ensure that we reauthorize Vawa. This year is the 25th year of reauthorizing Vawa, and if there's never been an urgency, there's definitely one today. We've noted that the movement in itself has transcended beyond rape crisis centers and those of us who've committed ourselves on the front line, but to every single person that you run across in the grocery store, you wear a t-shirt, people are interested. For the first time, people actually know what we do. They understand that sexual violence is a part of the culture that perpetuates the violence that happens in our country to our most vulnerable populations. It is that reason that we will continue to work together and continue to showcase those of you who work on the front lines every day on behalf of survivors and those of you who work in your local communities to change the norms, to speak to our policymakers, our community members, including our children, that we are all a part of what it takes to end sexual violence. There are 1,500 rape crisis centers in our network that provide that frontline experience that we're talking about. They're from rural America to metropolitan to our most urban and suburban cities across the country. They represent providing services to children, adult, and our most seasoned people in this country. There's no place in America that I believe isn't touched by those of us who commit ourselves daily to ending sexual violence. While every single state and U.S. territory has representation of those direct services, it is up to us to continue to support those services. And funding like VAWA is important to ensure that those services are able to be rendered and that we can continue to provide prevention education in our K-12 schools as well as in our higher education. Whether they are independent rape crisis centers or large county multi-service agencies, these programs rely on the federal funding. That is available through the Department of Justice, through the Violence Against Women Act, the Office of Victims of Crime, as well as the Center for Disease Control that has the rape prevention education funding, which is also included in the Violence Against Women Act. Each year we survey our local programs in our network, like the ones who are joining me here today, to ask about the need, the demand, but also their successes that they're having. This past year we found that over 80% of our programs had an increased demand for services. 51% had a waiting list for counseling, and 40% had a waiting list for prevention programs. Almost half the programs do not have a therapist on their staff. And we know that we spend our time talking about the importance of best practices, trauma-informed treatment, and to do that, we need to ensure that there is funding to provide those services to all 1,500 rape crisis centers across this country. Over the past decade, those of us who have worked on the issue of sexual assault have had a reckoning, realizing our programs, by and large, have not reached our most vulnerable communities. But I'm excited to say that we'll have some conversations today about some of the outreach that we're doing to our most vulnerable populations. When rape crisis centers started over 50 years ago, it was clear that it was based and rooted in our communities. And what we do know is that many of us got in the heavy rotation of our doors were open, our crisis lines were open, so we were serving those who had access to our services. We are really here in acknowledging that it is important that we recognize that our services are important services, valuable services, always have been and will be. But it is also important that we recognize and point and shine a light on the importance of ensuring that those who may not have direct access to our services have access to some services that are going to be equitable and accessible to all communities. And to that end, we'll continue to support our culturally specific organizations that are housed in communities, and we'll continue to uplift and build those culturally and vulnerable population services inside of the 1,500 rape crisis centers across the country. We believe it is vitally important to support the development of these culturally specific programs and services, and more importantly, we believe that we are on the road to do that, and we'll be able to continue to do that with the support of HR 1585. To that end, I'll turn it over to Indira Hennard, who is the Executive Director of the DC Rape Crisis Center, and I'll save her from saying it is the oldest rape crisis center in the country, and we are glad to have you join us, Indira.
Thank you, Monica. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such an honor to be with you all today to talk about such an important issue that is near and dear to my heart, and I know near and dear to my fellow colleagues' heart as well. I want to kind of take a moment just to kind of give you an inside look into what it means to do rape crisis center work and how the national conversation around Me Too is really impacting us on a local level. What we have seen in the Me Too conversation, and Me Too, as most of you I'm sure know, was really started by Tarana Burke 10 years ago to really uplift the voices of women of color who are survivors of sexual violence. In this Me Too conversation, it has enabled us to really talk about the elephant in a room, that we haven't really been able to do so in a really, really long time. The conversation that is happening on the national level, it is requiring us to really expand the paradigm in which we not only talk about sexual violence, but the context in which we view sexual violence. And that is really, really important. Sexual violence sits on a gender-based violence continuum. continuum. So it can range from anywhere from sexual harassment to sex trafficking to stalking to sexual assault. And it's important to know that you can't talk about sex trafficking, you can't talk about sexual harassment, you can't talk about stalking without talking about childhood sexual abuse, which is the gateway to a lot of other forms of gender-based violence. Most people who identify as an adult survivor of sexual assault have some elements of childhood sexual abuse. We also know that communities of color specifically are disproportionately impacted by sexual violence. Women and men in tribal communities are disproportionately impacted by sexual violence, as well as members of the LGBT community. So it's important to understand that and know that 1 in 4 women in general, 1 in 6 men identify as sexual assault survivors. So think about for a moment everyone who you interact with, and do that math and know that for the most part you're going to be interacting with the survivor, whether or not you know it or whether or not you don't know it. I think it's also important to note that this national conversation around Me Too, it's important that we begin to build the bridge between the local and the national conversation. The way that it is impacting survivors of sexual violence is when we see conversations happening on the news, whether it's through the Leaving Neverland documentary from Michael Jackson or R. Kelly or the various news media outlets, what's happening is survivors of sexual violence are bearing witness to someone else's trauma, to someone else's sexual trauma. And so what that does is twofold. One, it can give them the courage to talk about their trauma for the first time, but it can also open up old wounds as well. And so that's where we come in as rape crisis centers and local programs on the ground. We have seen a significant amount of survivors since the ignition of the Me Too conversation. Our center in general here in DC has seen a 20% increase in individual and group counseling and a 15% increase on our hotline. And so for rape crisis centers, what we do is, it is not our job to ask questions. It is not our job to pick apart stories. It is our job to know that there is a story there, and we create a process for facilitating healing. We operate from a trauma-informed, survivor-centered, anti-oppression lens. And so what trauma-informed means is it's from the front door to the back door. So for example, we just underwent renovations in our building. And so in my dealing with the construction men and workers who have been with us for the last 2 to 3 months, I had to sit down and have an intentional conversation with them about, I need to know not only who's in the building, but I need to know about sound and smells, and if there's anything that's going to trigger or impact our clients, right? And for them, I was talking a language that they did not understand, but they understand it now, right? And so the amount of detail that goes into for example, when a space is changed, that impacts the way in which a survivor shows up for their healing process. When we ask questions, when we ask them to regurgitate their story, it's re-traumatizing, right? Because what we know is that the way in which the brain stores and recalls memory, it's expected and it's normal that there's going to be a delay in memory. Right? No one can recall every single detail. I think it's also important to note that in general, rape crisis centers, for the most part, they do individual and group counseling. Our services are free. We serve survivors who are childhood sexual abuse survivors, who are survivors of sexual assault, harassment. We also serve secondary survivors, and what that means is they may not have a primary identification as a sexual assault survivor, but they have a loved one, they have a friend who has been sexually impacted, and that's also impacting them, and so we can serve them as well. In addition to that, we do prevention work, and we do community education and public policy advocacy. We are deep in our schools here because we know that we need to be having conversations around consent and healthy relationships from the time that kids are yay high, so that we can begin to disrupt that pipeline. In addition, I think it's important to know that we believe survivors, at the end of the day, it does not matter what the elements are. At the end of the day, we believe survivors. And so it is important that when you are engaging with survivors, that you know that everyone's story is different. Everyone's story is going to look different. There is no monolithic way, and it goes back to what I said earlier around we have to begin to expand the paradigm. I think it's also important to talk about the fiscal costs of what it means to be a survivor of sexual violence. For rape crisis centers, the insurgence that we have seen regarding the increase in demand in services has definitely impacted our budget. We all create budgets at the end of the fiscal year. That's pretty much gone out the window. Well, not gone out the window. I want the board to think we've gone a little rogue, but it's important to know that, for example, during the Dr. Christine Blasey Ford testimony during the Kavanaugh hearings, when we were doing extra client sessions in between normal sessions because people needed to have that extra support, that we had to find extra money for our contract therapists, that when survivors don't want to get on the metro, but they still need to come to the center, that we have to find that transportation assistance, that when we have a survivor who comes in who has not disclosed their trauma for the last 20, 30, or 50 years, and we know what it means to walk into a rape crisis center, and let's say, for example, she's 60, 65 years old, she has other health issues, and she ends up having an accident on herself, right? And that's normal because of the way in which the body holds trauma. And so that means for us as rape crisis centers, we're also thinking about the wraparound services that survivors of sexual violence are needing. And so we, are getting extra clothing and things like that, similar to what the DV community has. But for the sexual assault side, we never thought about creating a closet. And so I think the fiscal impact cannot be understated. The long-term medical impact that survivors have to go through in order to continue to deal with their healing, whether it's through free services or whether it's through private therapy, the long-term medical conditions that survivors can deal with, that costs a lot of money. And so we have to remember that there's a fiscal side to all of this. And so as we continue to move forward in this work, as we continue to have conversations in this work, the reauthorization of Vawa, there has never been a more important time to authorize any piece of legislation than it is the Violence Against Women Act. We cannot do this work with you. We have to do this work in partnership with you. And so I'm going to stop right here, but thank you all so much. The fact that you are here, the fact that you are willing to engage in this conversation, kudos to you. Take the information back, but thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Jonna from Iowa. She's this way. Sorry. I got my direction wrong. That's why I don't drive.
It's okay. Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here, and I thank you for sharing your time with us today. I am Jonna Sullivan, the Executive Director of Crisis Intervention and Advocacy Center in rural Iowa. In 1966, I was 5 years old, don't start doing the math, and proudly brought my show and tell item to class in the shoebox. When it was my turn, I sat down in the child-sized chair with all the other children sitting around me on the floor. I put my shoebox on my lap, I took the lid off, and I picked up a loaded handgun. All of the kids were impressed and excited, and as I was. My teacher calmly took the shoebox to her desk, and the rest of the day went on as normal at school. It was only after I had started this work that I started thinking about this memory, and I talked to my mom about it. My mom shared with me that she received a call from the school that day, and she came to the school with 2 black eyes, only to be shamed and criticized for allowing her daughter to bring a gun to school. Not one school staff person asked my mom how she was, or ever talked to me about my safety or what was going on in my home. It was like it didn't happen. So I grew up in a home where I witnessed domestic violence, and experienced sexual abuse by the same man for 10 years during my childhood. Because of the trauma I experienced, I made it my mission to advocate for others. This passion was instilled in me, and I became destined to lead others in advocating for sexual abuse survivors in our own rural communities. So what makes this work different in rural areas? Well, we don't ride around on horseback through open pastures, not regularly anyway. I prefer a truck. The truth is that the services are the same in rural, urban, and suburban areas because the abuses are the same. Survivors need to be heard, believed, and for our communities to unite around them. To unite a community in a rural area, it does look different and sounds different. Advocates do a lot of rolling up our own sleeves and providing assistance. We have gone to great lengths to serve rural survivors of sexual violence. We have packed homes, mowed lawns, painted homes, prepared meals in people's homes, attended meetings in dive bars, church basements, and gas stations. We post flyers and brochures in medical clinics, care facilities, laundromats, grain elevators, and livestock pavilions. When a town is so small, these are the only places that exist. Advocates in rural communities are open to going where people are. It's important that we meet people in their own homes, in their own communities, wherever it is that they feel safe. When volunteers aren't available and when it's an immediate need, our advocates do the work to lift the survivors out of the barriers they face. For example, a young mom and her 6-year-old child are sexually abused by dad. The mom wants out of the situation and deserves safety. When the mom contacts our agency, we will ask what she needs right now and then find a way to make this happen. Her most immediate need is to move, and yet she has no money, no vehicle, and no way to find out where a new place might be for her to live. Our advocate will unite the community and lead them in finding a new, affordable space to live within her budget. Our advocates will work with the landlord to waive the deposit. We will ask the landlord what they need to get this woman and her child into a new home faster. In rural places, we can't always simply find a different, more affordable option. So we must work on getting the 1 or 2 places that are currently available at that time for the survivor. The landlord will explain that the property needs painted, that it needs cleaned, and that there are some repairs. So guess what? We roll up our sleeves, we paint, we clean, we talk to the landlord about go ahead and let her move in now and continue to finish the repairs while she's living there so that she can be in a safe place. This way we get her housed a lot faster. My priorities as the leader of this nonprofit are centered around what survivors in rural communities want and need, no matter what barrier in the way. Sexual assault services weren't around when I was growing up, and when I started this work in this movement, they were limited. The only way I was able to get started was through the federal and state funds allocated to programs serving crime victims. Vawa was an important part of this agency's journey in 1994. I was only offered a position at this 2-person agency, and both people were not even full-time after Vawa was introduced. The first thing I wanted to change when I started was to add sexual assault services to the agency. The only service they were providing at the time was domestic abuse to 1 county. So we joined the Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Assault in 1995 and changed the name of the agency to reflect more inclusive services specifically for sexual abuse survivors. The state coalition support and guidance connects all of our local programs and makes any center stronger. One of my priorities is also to ensure those who serve rural survivors know and live in these areas. Our service area includes the fastest growing county and the poorest county in Iowa. The 10 counties include a total population of approximately 134,000, which is smaller than some U.S. cities. I'm well aware of that with the people sitting around me today. Rural advocates are on the road providing mobile services every day. Our 24-hour response system involves at least 3 staff members on call every night and many volunteers that make it possible. I hire staff strategically from rural communities to ensure they can respond quickly to all 9 rural hospitals and many local police stations. The distance from our northern to our southern counties is 2.5 hours. We have office spaces in all 10 counties, some of which are donated and some that we pay for. The goal is to provide as many locations as possible for survivors and the people that support those survivors so that we can meet them locally with rural advocates. A constant concern is that there is staff in every county every day. It is hard to do that when we serve 10 counties and 134,000 people and we have 23 staff. Since we have steadily increased funding, we have increased our sexual abuse specific staff. We used to only have 1 staff member providing services to sexual abuse, and now we have 11 full-time staff serving rural survivors. While we talk about helping survivors, but what does that really mean? It is important to provide a service menu so that everybody is provided the same offerings, and yet, more importantly, we listen. Really listen to what the particular person needs and wants. For example, our service menu includes what you heard earlier. It has 24-hour helplines, crisis counseling, support groups, legal advocacy, education, training, and prevention services. All of these vague items look different when provided. It is important that how we are helping someone is respectful and culturally appropriate. Things that we've provided not on the service menu include housing a llama so a survivor can flee. That's a true story. Taking a survivor to the grocery store, calling therapists to ask if they're trauma informed or if they've ever worked with sexual abuse survivors, and researching school systems in a new area where the survivor may want to move. The mounting challenge for rural programs like ours is to provide all these services in remote areas, so we go into people's homes and travel to all the cafes, coffee shops, courthouses, police stations, libraries, and places survivors feel comfortable. These services are only able to be provided in a mobile capacity by using personal vehicles and employees being paid at the state rate for mileage. Federal and state funds enable rural survivors to receive services in their own communities. It creates more barriers to thriving when we tell survivors to drive to the county seat to receive services. I know from building a responsible budget every year that the first thing to be cut if we receive budget cuts would be the mobility of services. Our program would go back in time to sitting in offices in cities, I say that lightly, waiting for survivors to show up rather than truly service communities by being in them, getting to know the stakeholders. Being a multi-service provider in a multi-county service area in rural Iowa, it is critical, to have sexual abuse advocates and survivors who specialize in sexual abuse services. I invest in training all staff on all trauma survivors we serve, which includes domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, homelessness, and homicide and violent crimes. While all staff are able to respond to any type of trauma, long-term services are trauma-specific. So a sexual abuse survivor will receive long-term services from a sexual abuse advocate within their own community. We want all staff to feel comfortable enough in their own skills to respond to any phone call or to any person who comes through the door, and feel confident in reassuring any survivor that they will receive trauma-specific services. We serve approximately 2,000 victims of crime each year, and of those, 700 of them are victims of sexual abuse. I hope I was able to be gentle, honest, and direct with my message, and I thank you with your time. I would now like to turn it over to Barbara Barbara Capos, who is the Executive Director for East Los Angeles Women's Center.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is an honor to be here along with our sisters, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the East Los Angeles Women's Center. In 1976, a group of dedicated Latinas established one of the first in the nation bilingual hotline for Spanish-speaking survivors of sexual assault. Today, East Los Angeles Women's Center, or known as ELAWC, delivers innovative, comprehensive, culturally responsive services that build on a foundation of trauma-informed, survivor-centered practices designed to heal, support, protect, and empower the communities we serve. The communities we serve is the greater East Los Angeles, Southeast Los Angeles, LA, and Boyle Heights. More than 500 survivors contact our center every month to reach trained and certified volunteers and counselors who speak the same language and understand the customs and traditions of the communities we serve. Our experience and our connection to the local culture enables us to provide the highly personalized, sensitive services to help survivors cope, survive, and ultimately thrive. I would like to focus on two unique approaches we have integrated into our service delivery. One, I'll talk about the hospital-based model, and a second on our culturally responsive, community-based approach. The first is a hospital-based model. We have a satellite office at the Wellness Center at LAC-USC Medical Center, located in Boyle Heights. LAC-USC is the largest public hospital and medical training center in the United States. Our presence at the medical campus assures immediate response to a victim of sexual assault or domestic violence. We respond to ER and to the other clinics and hospitals within 15 minutes, and on the weekends and evenings within an hour. Our advocates are able to connect with the survivors, providing immediate support and resources at their most vulnerable time. We have also trained over 3,500 healthcare professionals on how to identify trauma and the available resources to survivors. Most of the time, we can do a presentation, or we run with them when they're doing their rounds. The idea here is that we're giving them this information on how to really connect with survivors. Many times, survivors will come to the hospital and everyone will just ignore them, even in ER. So the doctors will ask us, well, what do I say? And that's the question that comes up over and over again. What do I say to them? So we help them through this training. We're there on site, so we're able to guide them through this. And through these efforts, we found that many of the survivors, both domestic violence and sexual assault, many times did not have a home to return to. They sometimes were afraid to return and nowhere to go, many times isolated from their families. And what we were able to do through the efforts of the county was actually establish a shelter on site, one of the first in the nation. And so through this crisis response, we're able to bring in a survivor from ER when they have nowhere to go and give them a safe place and help them transition to either another apartment or another shelter, wherever they want to go to. Since March of 2018, we've supported 160 survivors and their children at the shelter and helped them move to a safe environment. LA County has 5.1 million women and girls. That's huge, right? And 48% are Latino, 25% white, 16% Asian Pacific, 8% African American, and 3% other. So a culturally responsive approach is essential here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the project that is very dear to my heart, and this is a Promotora project. Promotoras are women in the community who we work with very closely, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. So our Promotora program is our culturally responsive program, and it empowers survivors and embraces the community, providing communities with the knowledge and the information and the tools to end sexual violence. This is really critical because when we did a study in Boyle Heights, and we asked the members of that community about domestic violence and sexual violence, and one of the main response that we got was that it will never change, that it's a norm, and that's just part of life. And we couldn't accept that. So we really worked at building this project so that we could really integrate into the community, because our belief is really the community is going to put an end to violence. So our Promotora project is nationally recognized as a peer education curriculum and a development program that was designed to provide comprehensive leadership training to Latinas. As a result, community women educate other community members about specific issues related to domestic and sexual violence in the Latinx communities. The goal of the program is to provide women with leadership capacity to facilitate presentations in multiple settings in the community, which includes maybe small gatherings in their own neighborhood or the large community events. Promotoras are primarily Spanish-speaking, immigrants from Mexico and Central America, survivors, warriors dedicated to this movement, whose voices will not be silenced until violence ends in their communities. They're phenomenal women, and their work is just, beyond what I can really share with you here. But utilizing this empowerment approach, promotoras seek to break isolation, create support, and provide resources to those who've been alienated. Many have been alienated and silenced because of the language barriers, immigration, lack of resources, and fear of many of the systems that may discriminate against them. So I'm going to tell you a little story about our promotoras. We have collectives, so this started as a small project and ended up being a huge project now. And we have 7 collectives, meaning women in different communities. Because if you know LA, there's Boyle Heights, but then Compton is on the other side of town, and there are different issues to address there, right? So we have 7 collectives, 1 in Boyle Heights, 1 in East Los Angeles, 1 in Compton, South LA, Long Beach, and we also have a collective of janitors who work together as a coalition. So together they find strength together, and we go in and we provide mentorship and training, but they are the force. So the collective in Boyle Heights decided that they were going to go to Ramona Gardens, which is a public housing project, and because there was identified violence there and a lot of isolation, and they did outreach, they put flyers on everyone's doors, and our 4 promotoras went to the housing project, and the Boys and Girls Club, which is on the site, said you can use our facility and you can do your workshops there. So they went, and guess what? Nobody showed up. So, okay, they went again, the same thing, outreach, not working. So then they noticed that there was bread distribution down the path. And so they went over there and they started talking to the women who were there to get the bread. And none of the women looked up, their heads were bowed, and they wouldn't make eye contact with the promotoras because they didn't trust them, or they, right? Even though they look like them, they speak the language, but still, they're coming from an organization, who are they? And there's a lot of pain there, and you could feel it, right? So they said, okay, we're going to stick it out here, So they started to talk to the women, and they started to make connections with them. Although they still didn't raise their heads, they said, look, we're here to provide information, workshops, And finally, they asked the women, what would you like to know about? And the women responded with their heads down, grief. I want you to talk about grief. And then another one said depression. Another one said about the sexual violence. How do I protect my child from getting hurt? So they said, okay, but we're not going in that building. okay. So they came back to us and said, what do we do? And said, we're going to do the workshops there where the bread distribution is. And that's what they did for 8 weeks. Rain or shine, they were there, the 4 promotoras, connected with the community there. And, they all came. They put the tables up, we brought the coffees, the bread, everything, and we did the promotoras did the workshops there. At the end, the women did lift their heads, and they did trust. And that's what this was about. It was about making those connections. And, I know that different communities that serve different cultures, we may do things a little bit differently, but really it's all about building trust and having that rapport. These are individuals that have had a history, a journey of pain. And so making that connection was critical, because now those individuals from the Ramona Gardens, we've identified leaders from that community, and now they've become promotoras. So now they are empowered. So I wanted to share that because I find it such a powerful incident that happened for us. We learn from our promotoras, and it's critical to continue to fund innovative approaches that meet our community's needs. So thank you again for being here. Now I'd like to pass it on to Julie Donelon from Kansas City.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Julie Donelon, and I'm the President and CEO at the Metropolitan Organization to Counter Sexual Assault, or MOXA, as we're known in Kansas City. MOXA has been around since 1969, serving as the only independent rape crisis center for the greater Kansas City area. So what that means is that our sole focus is on sexual violence throughout the lifetime. And we do that through our counseling program, our education programs, and our advocacy programs. And we work within the community to educate and prevent sexual violence. Each year we serve over 60,000 individuals through our programming in our 6-county bi-state area. While there are many services that MOXA provides in our community, today what I want to talk with you about is prevention. And like the other programs that we've talked about here today, prevention really is my passion, and we'll get a little bit more into it on why that is. But you've heard about the personal impacts of sexual violence, the physical, the emotional, and they're devastating. There's also an economic cost to our community as well. For sexual assault survivors, it's over $120,000 a lifetime for an individual who's been impacted by sexual violence. For child sexual abuse, it's over $210,000 in a lifetime for a child who's been sexually abused. Prevention, for every $1 that we put into prevention, it saves $5 in treatment and counseling moving forward. So you can see the return on that investment is really important, and it's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it. I see how much it costs running an independent rape crisis center, how much all of those services cost, and we haven't been doing enough to put money into preventing it to begin with. We will always be there responding and supporting survivors, but until we go upstream and change what's happening and change the culture in our schools and in our community, we're going to continue to have to put that money into responding. And no one deserves to be a victim of sexual violence, and so we want to change it. MOXA uses a social ecological model that focuses on multi-levels in responding to sexual violence. So we look at the individual level. So we provide counseling, we provide advocacy in hospitals when survivors go there for their exams. We look at the relationship level. So we're working with teachers, we're working with parents to help them, we're working with caregivers and people who are supporting survivors. We work at the community level, and I'll talk about 2 of those programs that have really shown amazing results in our community. And then we also work on the societal level. So we're working to change policies, we're working to implement laws that will help improve the lives and help change our culture around sexual violence. The 2 programs that I want to talk to you today about are funded by the Rape Prevention prevention education funding through VAWA. So you can see it's such an interesting and critical time to be here. I'm excited to be here in DC, knowing that House Bill is going to be voted on this week. That RPE funding is critical for us to do the services that we do in prevention specifically. There are not a lot of dollars that are available for prevention work, and RPE provides that. We would not have been able to start our Green Dot programming without that funding. And so the first program, I'm going to sort of a spoiler there, is our Green Dot program. We started that in 2014 in middle schools. So we started with 2 middle schools in the Kansas City area, urban middle schools, and have implemented it now for 5 years. The Green Dot program works on changing the culture of the school. So working with the administrators, the principals, the teachers, the children, bringing together a group of leaders within the school. And we have a prevention specialist who works with those students, and they are actually the leaders in changing their own culture within that school. So they put together marketing materials and events to help the other students recognize that, number one, violence is not okay, and that everyone has a part to play. And so it's a Bystander Intervention program. Based on the programming, generally you don't see results in a program like that until after it's been implemented for 3 years. After 2 years, we worked with the CDC on some outcome measurements, and after 2 years we saw, I'm going to look at my notes for this, we saw improvement and reduced violence within the school. So supportive skills, responsibility, and respect for differences. When we looked at those scores, they increased by 40%, and harmful student conduct decreased by 20%, and that was just after 2 years. We have seen this same type of impact in all the schools that we have implemented the programming in. We are now up to 10 schools, and most of the funding for that is through private foundations, so we do still get RPE funding, but in order to expand it, we had to do private fundraising, and so we're up to 10 schools now. But to give you some perspective, we have 30 school districts in Kansas City. So this critical program is not getting to every student. And really, until every student gets this programming, we're not going to be able to change our culture. We continue to do education, which is where a lot of those 60,000 individuals that we serve are impacted. So we talk to children about consent. We talk with them about safe and unsafe touches. But we know that in order to change our culture and to change behavior, it has to be multi-session work that we're doing within the community. So that is the Green Dot program. The other program I want to talk to you about, again, is funded by RPE, and it's our Wyandotte County Sexual Assault Program. So we're actually working at the community level, which is really exciting. So Wyandotte County is a county that is in Kansas, and it has the highest rates of homicides in the state of Kansas. With this program, we are working very much like the Green Dot program, but on a county level. So we're pulling in stakeholders to work with us to implement different strategies to change the way violence and people relate to each other within that community. So we've done lots of different surveys, working with lots of different groups to find out what is the need in this community. And so through that, we've identified a method that we're using, which is SECTED, so Community Prevention Through Environmental Design. So we are looking at strategies that impact violence and trying to change the opportunity for violence in communities. So what we're doing is working with communities to help clean up parks, increase lighting. We know that when you have active communities, when people are going out to the parks, when they feel safe because there's lighting and there's not trash everywhere, people will go out to those parks and they'll get to know their neighbors. We know that when people know each other, that the incidence of crime decrease and the social connectedness increases. We know how important those things are. Looking at So there was one project that we worked on. There was a bridge with a tunnel underneath it, and it was the shortest way to get to and from school for kids. Nobody ever used that because there were bushes that were covering it, there was no lighting, and there was a lot of drug activity that was happening in there. So we mobilized a group of our supporters to come together to help clean that up. We're working on getting new lighting there. Again, just working with the community and getting them invested in those projects really makes a difference. Other than the small successes, one of our biggest successes in that program was the incorporation of a violence prevention plan in the community health improvement plan. So violence prevention had never been included in that community health improvement plan, and the unified government for the first time introduced a violence prevention strategy as a part of that, and MOXA is the lead agency on that project because of the work that we did in the community. So we're really excited about, again, just changing that culture, people understanding that this is a community health issue and we need to start addressing it. You heard about the demand for services dramatically increasing over the last several years. One of the most memorable moments I had during the Me Too and Time's Up movement, we had a gentleman who just walked into our office and said, "I just need to be somewhere where somebody believes me and will listen to my story. I just have to be with somebody right now." And so we had an advocate come out and talk with that individual and support them and let them know that they're in a place where they could come and share their story and it was okay. We will always have a wait list for services. We always have and we always will. This is one of the reasons, again, why I'm so passionate about prevention, because we have a demand for that. We're in 10 schools. We could be in 100 schools, and really changing the number of survivors that are out there. Nobody needs to be a victim of sexual violence. We have ways to stop that. We have things that we can do to prevent it, and so we need funding in order to make that happen. One of those ways is the Reauthorization of Vawa. In that reauthorization, it is asking for an increase from $50 million in RPE funding to $150. That, again, was the funding that helped MOXA implement those two programs that now show success, and now we're able to do fundraising in order to continue those programs. And so we need that type of funding to kickstart these programs throughout the country because we know they make a difference. In closing, one thing I want to do is make sure that survivors aren't lost in this discussion. I want to let you know why I'm so passionate about sexual violence. And I think about Riley. She's a young college student. She was raped at work by her employer, who was also the owner of the company that she worked at. She was working full-time while also going to school full-time. As a result of the sexual assault by her employer, she had to quit her job. She then had to quit school. So this one person, this moment in time completely changed the trajectory of her life. She had to quit school because she couldn't afford. She could only find a part-time job after that. And she couldn't afford to pay for schooling as well as paying for her rent on a part-time job. She had trouble with transportation. She didn't have gas money to go to the law enforcement appointments that she needed to, talk to the detectives, go to the prosecutors, have the follow-up medical care that she needed, come to MOXA for her counseling sessions. MOXA was there to help her with all of those things, and we helped her with gas. We helped her with the counseling costs. We were there to support her all through that. But she is the reason that I'm so passionate and focused on preventing sexual violence, because Riley should never have to have been a victim of sexual violence. No one should ever have to be a victim or deserves to be a victim of sexual violence. And we can do better than just responding and intervening. We can do better, and we can stop and end sexual violence. So thank you for being here today, and thank you for supporting survivors.
Thank you all very much for your passion that you displayed, for sharing what is happening in your local communities, whether it's 134,000 people or well over several million people that you are serving. Each of your services are paramount to people's lives and their healing from survival to thriving, and we appreciate the work that you're doing. It would be lost if I didn't speak on, because you talked a lot about prevention, and I think the thing that I want to draw a parallel to is, and I think you heard the thread, but our work just isn't inside the doors and walls of rape crisis centers. Our works are in homes, in communities, in gas stations. Jonna, I was having a lot of flashbacks to working at a local service provider because I worked in a rural community right out of college, and my first meeting was in someone's home. I was not prepared to do that right out of college, I might add. But the important piece of that is our work is meeting survivors where they are. And when we speak about prevention, it's important that we acknowledge that our work isn't in a bubble. We don't end sexual violence by only speaking into sexual violence. We end sexual violence by speaking into our communities and recognizing that we all have a role to play. One of the most life-changing moments for me in this work was 10 years ago. I got appointed in North Carolina to the Institute of Medicine study on child success. And so it was literally all about the first 2,000 days of a child's life. And I was like, oh, that's great. They want me to be on their committee. What came out of that committee for me is the success of a child graduating on time in this country is predicted by they live a violence-free life for the first 18 years of their life. You heard Indira start out by speaking about 1 in 4 girls before the age of 18 are sexually assaulted. We've already disrupted their trajectory of being a successful student. Think about that, a student. That's the one thing that we all know that we do in America. At 5 years of age, at least, you're sending your child or you attended a school. For me, that totally shook my world, one, because I had a 3-year-old at the time, but the recognition that my work, I always knew it was greater than the work that I was doing in my community, but what it really said to me is we have to be connected to every institution, every part of our lives, because we are the people that we're speaking about. And we're ending sexual violence for Riley, for every single person that we've touched, for those that we haven't touched, but that know that we're there because they can call a free and confidential line just to say, I need to just hear your voice. There are many calls that we take that they never disclose their story. We don't ask them to share their story. They just need to know that we're there. That is what the Violence Against Women Act and all the funding that we ask for in support of here for our federal funding, that's what it does. It allows somebody to be on that line. It allows you to open the doors for someone to say, I just need somebody to listen. It allows you to open a clothing closet. It allows you to meet survivors where they are. If their heads are hung high, we recognize our work is to be there until they can lift them up. That's why we're here. That is the work that we're talking about that can't stop, and it won't stop, and we recognize that you're joining us here today because you support the Violence Against Women Act and will continue to share the importance, not just for the communities that we've talked about, but for all of our communities. One of the things that the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence has been very clear on is we really are speaking into what it means to our sisters who are Native, our sisters who are Latino, and quite frankly, all of our sisters and brothers whose lives are touched by sexual violence. And so I think it's also important because you didn't hear it here, but we want to acknowledge that Reliance and the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence will continue to advocate and support our sisters on tribal lands who do not currently have the ability to prosecute non-Native perpetrators who come onto their land and assault their women, their sisters, our brothers. That is our work. And the more that we see ourselves in the people's eyes that we look in, the closer we get to actually preventing all forms of violence in this country. They are all interconnected. Sexual violence is woven into the fabric of this country, and I wouldn't be able to get up every morning if I didn't think that those of us in this room and across this country didn't have what it takes to end sexual violence. And that is just sheer will. Sheer will to say that we'll continue to advocate, we'll continue to talk about it, we'll continue to be present, even if it means our silence is all that they need in that moment. That's the work that I ask you to continue to support us and continue to do.